Is that because they found no entrance into the house?
We don't know why.
Well, we know, Larry, that a window was open. Under that window was a suitcase, as if a step to get up through it. We learned later that they found a door open, which I didn't know about until almost a year later. That house was not difficult to get in.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 3 in the Carnes Order series, and in this episode the judge reviews the events that transpired, severely compromising the crime scene. In this episode we will deal with page 11, page 12, 13, 14, 15 and 16 of the 93-page report. What I want to pay particular attention to are John's comments, as highlighted in the Carnes Order, about the open basement window. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So page 11 kicks off with a series of events that transpired that severely compromised the crime scene. And what she's really talking about here is the behavior of the police officers, of the investigators. There's another way to think about it, which is that some other people severely compromised or perhaps covered up the crime scene. You could argue that the ransom note is something that is severely manipulating the crime scene to make it look in a different way. That the movement of JONBENET's body from wherever it was to the wine cellar, and from the wine cellar to the upstairs hallway, and from there to the Christmas tree, that also severely compromised the crime scene. But let's go with the judge's narrative. And this is quoting from the Carnes Order. Officer Rick French of the Boulder Police arrived at the defendant's home in a marked car a few minutes before 6 a.m. I don't know if it was a few minutes. I think it was really something like 5:59, might have been 5:57, but it really didn't take him a long time to get there. From Officer Rick French's own report, this is not in the Carnes Order, but what he says is that he responded to the 911 call at 05:55, but we know that he got there before 6 p.m., which implies that he got there very shortly before 6 p.m., right? It's something that is frustratingly unclear. Just a simple detail like that is at what exact time did he get there? And fortunately, in today's law enforcement world, often the police body cam and cell phones can provide the exact timestamp in terms of that. And he was followed soon after by Detective Arndt. Now, that just isn't true. So this is a summary provided by the judge. It's just not true. So Rick French arrived just before 6. But Detective Linda Arndt arrived at 10 past 8. That's 2 hours, 10 minutes later. I wouldn't say that is soon after. Now, you might say that this is nitpicking over details, but, you know, there's a saying that if you can't be honest about small things, you can't be trusted with big things. And it might be a reference to how you treat money, or how you treat, you know, how trustworthy you are with relationships or whatever. But I think the same applies with facts. If you're not trustworthy with small information, trustworthy might be the wrong word. If you're just not really paying attention to the small details, how are you going to be able to get the big details right? So that's something that I think is very important. I'm going to raise another important thing that is regarding timing in another episode, regarding where John takes photos with his camera and gives it to Detective Linda Arndt. But let's just continue with the Carnes Order. This is quoting further from page 11. Contrary to normal protocol, the police did not seal off the defendant's home, with the sole exception being the interior of JONBENET's bedroom. End quote. Now, I think, to be fair, what's happening is they first want to find JONBENET. There's a little bit of a difference where you presented with a crime scene where it's obvious there's the person lying dead, right? And so now you seal off the crime scene. And because it's not like that, there could be quite a few different explanations. And often in a missing person's case, you don't seal off the crime scene because you don't know if there was definitely a crime. In any event, the fact that they didn't seal it off is unfortunate, but you have the same thing in Portugal with the McCanns, and there are quite a few instances where a crime scene is allowed to be a crime scene for an extended period of time. The Amanda Knox case comes to mind as well. The Chris Watts case comes to mind as well. I also think that the interior of JONBENET's bedroom isn't the crime scene. I think if you were going to seal off a room, that's not the place to start. Probably a good place to have started was the basement, but it's difficult to actually say where the crime happened. I'm not 100% sure if it did happen in the basement. There are few reasons that might indicate that, but it's possible it could have occurred in another room as well, which I think says a lot. Going back to the Carnes Order, in other words, any person in the Ramsey house could and often did move freely throughout the home. The Whites arrived at the defendant's home at approximately 6 a.m. and Mr. White alone searched the basement within 15 minutes of arrival. Mr. White testified when he began his search the lights were already on in the basement and the door in the hallway leading to the basement, the wine cellar, was opened. What's quite interesting is John Ramsey actually refers to this wine cellar as a coal cellar in, it may have been the interview with Larry King that I played at the beginning of this clip. I just came across it somewhere, I'm not 100% sure where he said that, but it is interesting that there are different names for this particular room. To me, it does feel a bit more like a coal cellar than a wine cellar, and the judge will talk in some detail about the details, the interior of the room, how the room appeared, and the evidence in the room and all that kind of thing. I think it's very interesting that when Fleet White goes into the basement, he finds the lights already on. I think that is very interesting. I think it's interesting because I personally believe that the 911 call was made from the basement. I suspect the ransom note may have been written in the basement as well. It's possible that it could have been written in a couple of different places as well. But I think the 911 call was made in the basement, and that is why the lights were on. And I don't think the lights being on in the basement would necessarily be easily visible from the outside of the house, right? The amazing thing is that Fleet White actually checked the wine cellar. So he actually opened the door and looked inside, but he wasn't able to see anything because he couldn't find the light switch. So everything could have been resolved in if you're talking about the crime scene being compromised, if JONBENET's body was discovered then by Fleet White, it could have changed a lot. Then Fleet White testified that when he went down to the wine cellar, a window in the basement was broken, right? Now, this is going to be basically the focus of this episode, is why did that not factor into the police reports, into the police's attention, meaning there's a broken window and it's apparently an open window. Now bear in mind, right here doesn't refer to the windows being open, just broken. So why is it not they're looking for where the intruder the kidnapper got access, well, why are the cops not paying attention to this window? Think about what we're talking about. The Ramseys call 911 at about 5:52. The police arrive, more and more police arrive, and there's apparently a broken window and apparently an open window. And so why wouldn't everyone gravitate around this broken open window? This is the point of entry and exit of the intruder, right? Now this is something that seems to escape Judge Carnes, because all of this is dealt with in retrospect. So the importance of the basement window will actually be established later, right? Not on really the day after Christmas. It's going to be established later as the intruder narrative is established. I just want to emphasize that if an intruder broke in and there was something strange about windows being open, you would think that the Ramseys would focus on it and draw the attention to the law enforcement, wouldn't you? If it was a genuine situation like that, and they were asked about, were any doors or windows left open, you would think that at the time it would be the focus of what would be spoken about, wouldn't you? And so we're going to deal with that in this episode, the fact that that didn't happen. Now, you can argue that it did happen and it's just something that the police forgot about or didn't take note of, but we're going to deal with that in due course as well. We're going to deal with what the police said about the broken windows. And that comes through in Linda Arendt's report. So now we go further through the middle of page 11. The court notes, however, that although plaintiff presents such evidence in support of his theory that Mrs. Ramsey was depressed and that her depression contributed to her state of mind on the night of December 25, such evidence, if accepted as true, cuts against plaintiff's theory that Mr. Ramsey assisted his wife in the cover-up of JONBENET's murder. In other words, if the marriage was shaky, it arguably seems less likely that the innocent spouse would help the guilty spouse cover up her murder of their child. Now, I've got to acknowledge that on Patreon there are a couple of people who suspect that Patsy was guilty or that the other party was guilty, right? And my counter-argument to that is exactly this. It's if one of the spouses was guilty, it would make no sense for the other spouse to cover for them, not only to cover for them, but to be dragged through the mud of accusations. And in particular, if their marriage was shaky. And I have a sense that their marriage wasn't perfect. It wasn't as perfect or a perfectly happy marriage. I think that cancer diminished the happiness of the Ramsey home, and I also think that John was extremely busy and caught up in working at Access Graphics, and I think that took him away from the family home for extended periods, so that JONBENET missed him, but also I think Patsy missed him. But the glue that keeps family together is paying attention to one another, caring for one another, being with one another, and I think some of that was not the case. You could say going out the window. The other thing is Patsy's focus on pageants, I think that was her focus, and as a result, so the other thing I think just that does seem to support that is that the housekeeper didn't notice much warmth between the Ramseys. Now you could say, well, they just like that as a couple, it doesn't mean anything, but I think it's a very important point to make that if the marriage was shaky and one of the two Ramseys committed the crime, it would be the straw that broke the camel's back, and it would be the reason to say, okay, well, this marriage isn't even working. Now you've really ruined everything, and so why wouldn't the one turn on the other? And that is the crucial question in this scenario. And I think it excludes them both from directly committing the crime, this argument. I think it's a strong argument, but I also don't think it has been answered yet to completion. I think this is also the reason why the judge ultimately went against not only the theory of Steve Thomas, but why she went for the intruder theory, because she was presented with two theories. I think both don't make a lot of sense. Both aren't completely logical. If you're going to say the intruder theory is valid, then you can also say, well, the ransom note doesn't really make sense, even with that. If you're going to talk about the intruder theory is valid, then your entry and exit point doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. Why would you not enter through the basement but exit through kind of the front door or, a door? Just find an easy way out kind of thing. A quick, easy exit. So there's more to say about that, but let's move on. The judge does mention here, although referred to as wine cellar, the room was actually used for storage and was a dark, dirty area with mold growing on the floor. And that was from Fleet White's deposition. Now we move to page 12. Under the broken window, Mr. White states there was a suitcase along with a broken shard of glass. Now bear in mind, the suitcase under the window is suggesting that it's being used as a step in order to exit the house the same way that the intruder came in. As I said, it just doesn't really make any sense that you would come through the basement window, go up the stairs to the first floor, to the ground floor, and then perhaps up the spiral staircase to JONBENET's room, to pick up JONBENET. This is the scenario of the intruder theory. Pick up JONBENET and then come back down the stairs, creak, 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 and then you would not just exit at a door that is right beside you. You'd pass several doors and windows on your way back down to the basement through this very difficult exit point. And you could argue that this is what the intruder did, he found he couldn't exit. He couldn't put JONBENET in the suitcase and he couldn't carry her out, and so that plan failed miserably. In other words, exiting through the basement. I just don't think that it makes any sense that that would be the case. It doesn't make any sense, nor does it make sense that he would leave the garrote behind, his murder weapon, and also that the other murder weapon, possibly the baseball bat that didn't belong to the Ramseys, is also left outside in the garden, but we'll get to that in a second. So what is quite unfortunate, just below the top of page 12, or at the top of page 12, Mr. White does not remember whether the window was open or closed. Now, I am going to make an inference here. It's dangerous to do so, but I think not remembering whether the window was open or closed, I think, suggests that it was closed. What I mean by that is, I think if the window was open, you would have noticed it. You would have noticed it because it was bitterly cold, and you would have noticed it because it's something that is standing out. It's standing open, right? If you look at the crime scene photos and you imagine what you're looking at in that very cluttered basement is a closed basement window, you're not going to notice it's closed, in the same way that if there are if there's no snow, for there to be no footprints in the snow, you're not going to notice that there's no footprints in the snow. You don't notice something where nothing is noticeable. So Mr. White also opened the door to the wine cellar room, but he could not see anything inside because it was dark and he could not find the light switch. What's great about Fleet White going down into the wine cellar is it provides context for when John goes down into the basement. It's also interesting that a friend finds his way to the wine cellar, but apparently the Ramseys don't. Later that same morning at around 10 a.m., Mr. Ramsey also searched the basement area alone. He testified he found the broken window partially open. Now, what I think is interesting with that is according to this description here, it is the basement window is partially open. And we're going to get to that in a little bit more detail. What I want to emphasize here at the moment is just that he's not saying the basement window was wide open, but partially open. Now, if you take that at face value, what that seems to be suggesting is that the basement window, if it's not wide open, then the intruder actually closed the window behind him on the way out. And not just that, that the door that he went into to go into that particular room was also closed with a chair placed against it on his way out. It just doesn't make any sense, does it? So we're going to freeze on the Carnes Order through about midway through page 12 and just deal with some of the statements made by John Ramsey in television interviews and in his book, or in their book, The Death of Innocence. Shall we start with the book? On the bottom of page 20 of the Ramsey's book, The Death of Innocence, he talks about the basement window and the circumstances around it. That he remembers, he says, sometime that morning, I remember a day back in the summer when I had left my keys inside and was locked out of the house. So he's basically talking in the book about sometime through the course of the morning, he suddenly remembers that he broke that window, and then he ventures down into the basement, and he says, I think about the basement now. I jump up and hurry down there. So he doesn't tell anyone, he goes down by himself. He then thinks things to himself. It's written in italics in the book. He even uses the words, I tell myself. And then he says, the pane is still broken and the window is open. And that's all how he describes it. He just describes it as the window is open. And then the rest is kind of in italics, where he's thinking, could this have happened? Could that have happened? Did the kidnapper get in here? Did he, did he use the Samsonite suitcase to, as a stepping stone, not a stepping stone, but a object on which to stand to leverage him on the way out, right? And then and this is the part that's so interesting. It's on the top of page 21. He writes, I don't look further after finding the window open, but I carefully close it before going back upstairs. And then there's quite a lot of italics after that. So that is just a quote from The Death of Innocence. I think the important admission there is that John says that he closes the basement window, right? Now, what I think that is telling us is that the basement window was closed for all intents and purposes when everyone else came down into the basement, right? I'm guessing, and I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that the basement window was closed all along, that when Fleet White came down, it was closed. I think he would have noticed it if it was open, because it would have been cold. There would have been cold air streaming in. That Christmas night was a particularly cold evening. Christmas Day was also particularly cold. I've checked the weather records, and you would have definitely felt that cold air. Bear in mind there was also a furnace further in the basement, which would have been warmer, but you would have felt this cold air coming through there. Bear in mind that it also, trace snow had fallen that night as well. So it was cold enough for snow to fall and for snow to linger, certainly before the sun came up. I seem to remember a similar situation in the Oscar Pistorius case, where he gets up in the middle of the night. This is him talking about his scenario. He gets up in the middle of the night and opens the balcony door, I think, to bring a fan in, and then brings the fan in and closes the balcony door again. So the end result is the same as the beginning result. I think the other thing that he did was he opens the curtains, opens the door, and then closes the curtains again. But in terms of the story he's telling, what he ends up doing ends up being undoing itself. So it is as if it never happened. So I think this contention that John Ramsey closes the window and the window is then later found open is very interesting. I think the question is, when was that window opened? I have an idea it was opened at some time, possibly in the morning. It could also have been opened in the afternoon. It could have been opened by law enforcement. But that window gained significance as the day wore on, whereas I don't think even the Ramseys thought of that as the likely route of the intruder or kidnapper. I mean, at the time. I do think somebody else paying attention to it, do you think maybe someone could have come in this way? Maybe something Fleet White said may have made a little light come on in someone's mind. Before we move on from the open window, I want to refer to John Ramsey's statement on the 30th of April 1997 when he was interrogated by Steve Thomas and Tom Trujillo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And what he says is very specific. He says he's talking about the window was open about 1/8 of an inch and that he just kind of latched it. So he says, I went back down with Fleet. We looked around for some glass again, still didn't see any glass. And so you can interpret this to that is when he talks about the window being open about 1/8 of an inch, that is actually part of his description of when he broke into that basement window, right? The other thing I think that we should just highlight is I don't think any fingerprints were found on that window, not of John Ramsey's, not of anyone. I could be wrong. I think that would have come out if that was the case. No fingerprints were found on the window, so why not? Why aren't they there? Now in the McCann case, Madeleine McCann, I think the only fingerprints that they found that were relevant were Kate McCann's, and Kate McCann said she I think she went to the window or something like that. But why are there not intruder's prints on the window that the intruder used? Why are there no fibers? Why is there no sign of dirt or whatever? Anyway, we're going to get to that. There's this contention that there were little pieces of popcorn stuffing, that plastic that is sometimes used in the packaging of things. I think some of that was found distributed in the basement, and someone said that was caused by the intruder coming in through the basement window. And then Steve Thomas responded that there was nothing like that when they investigated the crime or in crime scene photos. But when people subsequently came much later, and bear in mind you had people coming in through that window like Lou Smith testing the theory, then they would later find evidence of, for example, Lou Smith coming through there and say, oh, isn't this what the intruder left? And so it's quite an interesting scenario where someone else coming through the window to demonstrate that it was possible, leaving debris, is now said, oh, this is the debris of the intruder. Because you would expect in a scenario where there's snow, which is damp, and leaves and dirt, that it would leave a trail, wouldn't you? Now I want to refer to the police report that Detective Linda Arendt wrote, and she wrote that John Ramsey paced between the area of the den and the formal dining room. John was usually by himself. I did not see John or Patsy interact with each other. This is also something that she observed, right, that there's not much comforting of John of Patsy or Patsy of John, and you've got to wonder, does this give reinforcement to the idea that their marriage was shaky? So yeah, you've got a second individual that is making this claim, not making the claim in a direct way, just that they are not being very warm to one another. It goes on to say, no one in the house made any obvious comment to me that it was after 10 o'clock and the suspected kidnappers had not called. From the time I arrived at the Ramsey house until approximately 10 o'clock, I had a few brief conversations with John. I had asked John if the doors to the house had been locked when the family went to bed last night. And I'm going to now deal with his response there after dealing with what John said in a television interview. I think this comes from the Today Show from 1999, so a year before the book was published. John Ramsey said, "We had a basement window that was under a grate, a removable grate that I had used the past summer to get into the house when I'd lost my keys. I wanted to check that window. I went down to that room. The window was open. It was broken. I went back upstairs and reported that to Detective Arndt." Katie Couric says, "You did tell her about the..." John Ramsey says, "Yes." Couric says, "The open window." John Ramsey, "I did." Couric, "And what did she say?" John Ramsey, "I don't recall she said anything." Now, if we go back to Linda Arendt's report, she says, "I had asked John if the doors to the house had been locked when the family went to bed last night. John told me that he personally checked all of the doors and all of the windows in the home this morning. All of the doors and windows were locked. John told me that although the house does not have..." And then he talks about the alarm system. So Arndt specifically asked him about this, and then he never said anything. And she's referring to a time, she's writing this chronologically, and she's talking about what happened after 10 o'clock. That after this time that the kidnapper was supposed to call, she spoke to John about the doors and the windows. This was his opportunity to mention it to her, and it's certainly not mentioned in her report. Now, you would think that if he did mention it to her or to any policeman, that again they would gravitate towards this entry access point, this entry exit point. You would think that they would study it, they would look, and I think one of the things they would notice is, especially if it had happened very early, they would have noticed, well, there's no footprints in the snow on the other side. And we've got a photo of that access point of the grate where there is snow, and there don't appear to be footprints, do they? In the 2016 NBC documentary, the Dateline documentary, there's also a photo through the window which shows the snow right surrounding the grate and no footprints in the snow. So in terms of this open window, in 1997, Steve Thomas said, you mentioned you went down in the morning, the 26th, and that window in the basement was unlatched. Did that strike you as odd, or did you bring that to anybody's attention? So Thomas is now trying to push John into a corner, basically saying, okay, so if the basement window was odd, if it stood out, if it was like, wow, this is really strange, if you thought it was important, why didn't you bring it to anybody's attention? And if you go to the book, The Death of Innocence, it does seem as though it strikes him as odd, because he talks about, I jumped up and hurried down there, and he goes straight to the basement window. He says in italics, that entry place needs to be looked at, I tell myself. And also at the bottom of page 20 he says, odd, I think. This doesn't look right. And so the question is, so it's very odd to you, you run down specifically to look at that. Well, do you tell anyone? Do you tell the police that are there to investigate that? And what I think is very interesting in the narrative, The Death of Innocence, is in the narrative he seems to check the window, go back upstairs, and then he says, I carefully closed it before going back upstairs. And the next line is, I constantly think about JONBENET. So he doesn't go back upstairs and tell Linda Arendt anything in this narrative, right? So that is what Steve Thomas is getting at, is, so did you think it was odd? Now in the book he says odd, I think, but now in this 1997 interrogation he asks him, well, did you think it was odd? And John responds, I don't know, I mean, when I was, I think it was probably struck me as a little odd, but it wasn't. I mean, sometimes that window would be open because the basement got hot, or one of those windows would be open, so it wasn't, Thomas, particularly unusual. John, it was dramatically out of the ordinary, but that is, I thought about it. So I'm not quite sure what John's answer is here. Is it strange or is it not strange? But from what you get here is that it wasn't strange enough to actually tell anyone about it. But then in subsequent interviews, he says that he did. It was strange enough to tell Linda Arndt about it, but then Linda Arndt says she wasn't told. Now you could say, whose word do you believe? Do you believe Linda Arndt or do you believe John? Do you think that Linda Arndt just forgot, or do you think that John noticed a window and didn't really think much of it at the time? Perhaps he thought more of it later on. In 1998, Lou Smith also asked him about it. Did you tell anybody about that? John says, I don't really remember. And I think it comes up again. Tom Trujillo says, did you notice if the room was overly cold? And what he's saying when he says that is, if the room was cold, it would mean the window was very likely open. And John Ramsey responds, no, it wasn't. I didn't notice that it was. And that is possibly the same experience Fleet White had. You would imagine that if he was in the house and he went into the basement and there was this icy breeze, literally an icy breeze blowing, that he would have noticed it, that he would have mentioned it. Something also worth mentioning, in his interview with Lou Smith, he was asked about, he said, I think entry was gained through the basement window, and Lou Smith answers, why do you think that? And John Ramsey says, because the window was cracked open. Now, cracked open to my ears sounds like it was just open. It was open just slightly, right? In other words, it's almost like someone else might look at it and it looks closed, but it's actually just barely open. Something else I want to highlight from his statement is that he spoke about when he broke into his own home in the summer, that he said, you've got to be careful if you drop those last 2 feet in the basement. You had no idea what was waiting for you at the bottom because there was a mess. You could have a suitcase like there was there, but you could have all sorts of other things, kids' toys. You could sort of crash onto something, perhaps an artwork or something. And so it was actually quite dangerous in a way to land in this pile of junk on the other side of that window. On Larry King, in March 2000, Larry King asked, in the book you write about the suitcase in the open basement window, but the police say you never told them about it. John Ramsey answers, that's false. Patsy Ramsey adds, false. John Ramsey adds, I told Linda Arndt that I found the window open, and I found a suitcase under the window. They have photos of this in their crime scene photos. In the JONBENET series, we sort of spoke about the narrative of neglect. Well, doesn't this window fit into that as well, where the window was broken the previous summer, and then Thanksgiving goes by, even Christmas goes by, and they're about to go on a holiday, and the window is still broken? Doesn't that give you a sense that things that need to be sorted out aren't? I mean, they cleaned up the glass, but they didn't fix the window. And when John was asked about this by Steve Thomas, he said, is there any reason that window went unrepaired? He said, no, I mean, Patsy usually took care of those things, and I just rarely went to the basement, so it just, I guess, got overlooked. Although she did think that she asked the cleaning lady's husband to fix it over Thanksgiving when they were doing some repair work there. But I don't know if that's ever been confirmed, whether he fixed it or not. So it's kind of being pushed onto the cleaning lady, or the cleaning lady's husband should have done it. I just want to go to Patsy Ramsey talking about this particular aspect. And she's interviewed by Trujillo, and he says, is there any reason why that window wasn't replaced or the pane wasn't fixed or anything? Patsy responds, no, I don't know whether I fixed it or didn't fix it. I can't remember even trying to remember that. I remember when I got back in the fall, quite an interesting statement there. I can't remember trying to remember that. She doesn't know whether she fixed it or didn't fix it. Then she says, went down there and cleaned up all the glass. I mean, I cleaned that thoroughly, and I asked Linda to go behind me and vacuum. I mean, I picked up every chunk. I mean, because the kids play down there in that back area back there. What's interesting is she says, I can't remember whether I fixed it or didn't fix it, but then talks about cleaning the glass and picking up every chunk. It's sort of quite specific memories. You can actually remember picking that up. Then she says, I mean, I scoured that place because they were always down there. Burke particularly, and the boys would go down there and play with cars and things. And there was just a ton of glass everywhere. She goes on to say, I cleaned all that up, and then she vacuumed a couple of times down there to get all the glass. And then, do you ever recall getting that window replaced? Patsy says, I can't remember. So we spent a lot of time just going into other materials, supplementary materials, just on the notion of this window. Was it open or closed? Who broke it? When was it broken? Now let's return to the Carnes Order. Later that afternoon, Mr. Ramsey and Mr. White together returned to the basement at the suggestion of the Boulder police. That was actually Linda Arndt. During this joint search of the basement, the men first examined the playroom and observed the broken window. The men next searched a shower stall located in the basement. What's interesting is there's no mention of whether the window's open or closed in this particular part of the order. We're now at the top of page 13. Mr. Ramsey then noticed a heavy fireplace grate propped in front of a closet, and Mr. White moved the grate so the closet could be searched. It's quite interesting that John notices this thing. Oh, wow, let's look at this. And it's propped in front of the closet, and then that is what they look at. And then they don't find anything there in the closet, and then they go to the wine cellar room. John Ramsey enters the room first, turns on the light, and upon discovery of JonBenet's dead body, he exclaimed, "Oh my God, my baby." And what is interesting here is that it's just said quite matter-of-factly that John turned on the light. Now bear in mind, when Fleet went, he couldn't find the light, opened the door, couldn't find the light switch, looked inside, couldn't really see anything, and then closed the door and nothing happened. In the Ramsey's book, The Death of Innocence, I'm going to read that moment to you as well. And this is quoting from page 22, about 1 or 2 paragraphs down. And he's talking about Fleet and himself in the basement, heading downstairs after they'd spoken to Arndt. Quote, "We continue our search, and a few minutes later, I'm at the door by the furnace. I open it and see JonBenet lying on the floor with a white blanket around her." End quote. You notice no mention of the light switch. Now, there are 2 scenarios to imagine here. One is that John finds JonBenet and in the dark removes the duct tape, in the dark removes the one ligature around her wrist, which is loosely tied around her wrist. The other possibility is that Fleet finds the light switch behind him and Fleet turns it on. But there's some interesting confusion about whether the light switch was turned on or not. So, returning to the Carnes Order, quote, JonBenet had black duct tape covering her mouth, a cord around her neck that was attached to a wooden garrote, and her hands were bound over her head in front of her. She was covered by a light-colored blanket. A Barbie nightgown belonging to JonBenet was also found in the wine cellar near her body. JonBenet's blood was found only on her body and the Barbie nightgown. Mr. Ramsey ripped the duct tape off JonBenet's mouth and attempted to untie her hands. He then carried her body upstairs. It was only upon the discovery of JonBenet's body that the Boulder police began to secure properly the home as the crime scene. Now we're at page 14. JonBenet's body was bound with complicated rope slip knots and a garrote attached to her body. The slipknots and the garrote are both sophisticated bondage devices designed to give control to the user. Evidence from these devices suggests that they were made by someone with expertise using rope and cords, which cords could not be found or sourced within the defendant's home. The garrote consisted of a wooden handle fashioned from the middle of a paint